Hey guys, Claudia here. This is a really hastily thrown together video, or rather audio, because my laptop is currently getting repaired. It went wrong just at the end of my masters, of course, and it's battled on for a while, but I don't have it at the moment, so I'm trying to make do on something else. I can't do usual video editing, so I thought I'd just put this here. It's mostly going to be my voice, but there's going to be some things on the screen. So, this also isn't scripted, by the way. I'm sure it won't be particularly articulate. So, yesterday I watched a documentary by David Baddiel, which is called Jews Don't Count. Now, you might know on my channel I've made a video about David Baddiel before. He did a documentary about trolling, and it was about social media, anger, and me. And it basically came across from my perspective like he was a centrist, quite privileged celebrity that actually just didn't like being spoken back to by the masses, and felt that he'd been in a privileged club before, and basically, oh, everyone's so angry and they're calling me out, and this kind of deep feeling that I got from him, just personally, is that he felt quite slighted, like some comedians do now, that, oh no, I might be cancelable. You know, that kind of feeling of, oh, I'm being cancelled for my good humour, and you go back in time and you look at the good humour and it was just sexism or racism or homophobia. That's what it felt like. Anyway, I won't get into that here, but that was another video I made. And I think it was kind of, I've noticed a pattern with David Baddiel where he tries to present himself as this kind of neutral, like, presenter. He tries to do a Louis Theroux kind of thing. But the thing with Louis Theroux is that he very often, you know, he doesn't really commit to a point of view. He's an observer. He doesn't really push an opinion. I know nothing can be unbiased, but he doesn't really push it. But David Baddiel has got this thing where he likes to position himself as this, you know, investigator of things. But then he actually uses these documentaries to actually kind of get personal jabs in and kind of personal opinions on things. Which again wouldn't be a problem if he owned it, but he's now currently trying to set himself up as this big anti-racism campaigner. And it's just so fake. And just to, you know, to preface this, you know, he is Jewish. He does suffer anti-Semitism. He has every right to speak about the anti-Semitism that he suffers. You know, there is no force on this earth that should stop him from doing that. I completely support him in doing that. What I do object to is him presenting himself as this overall anti-racist figure, when yes, of course he suffers anti-Semitism, of course he does, but also he has a history of anti-black racism. You know, he's got a history of anti-traveller racism, he's got a history of homophobia, and it's like a sort of rebrand. It's like there's two different ways that former comedians seem to be branding themselves right now. Dodgy ones, not nice ones. You've got people who are like doing a Ricky Gervais and doing the whole cancellation tour. You know, oh, I was cancelled and no one wants to listen to me, and then they sell out more and more, you know, performances because they're pretending that they've been cancelled. You hear them talking about being cancelled on the TV, on the main channels. So cancelled. And then you get the other lot, who I actually find a little bit more insufferable. I've got to be honest. I find this more insufferable than someone like Ricky Gervais, because this sort of person suddenly, it's that feeling of I can do no wrong, you know. It can't just be a sincere sort of, you know, yeah, I did wrong, and this is why I did wrong, and I want to do better, you know. It's got to centre them. And now they're kind of setting themselves up as these kind of, you know, academic, like, philosophical, you know, these journeys of discovery, where somehow their journey of discovery is meant to be this universal thing, you know. It's so annoying. You know, I think something we're suffering with, or we're experiencing now, is that progressive language is actually being used by people with bad intent to kind of cloak their own inadequacies. So it's very surface level, and I find it very fake. What we do know with David Baddiel is we know, obviously, his history of anti-black racism, which in the documentary, you know, he does address some of this. But it's not just the Jason Lee issue. I won't go through the whole thing because I'm assuming you've seen the documentary if you're listening to this. But this Jason Lee incident, you know, it was, so he blacked his face up and he would mock his hair, and he would, you know, he would act like, oh, it was a pineapple, and it would be a great fun joke, which even at the time I don't think could have been funny. And, you know, I've still seen people defending that, even though David Baddiel himself has, you know, to his credit, finally, and on a very public platform for his own benefit, not a direct apology. You know, just to put this in here, I feel like if you truly feel bad about something, you know, it's been 20 years, and I'm not saying that we, you know, people have to be perfect. Of course not. You know, there are so many good people out there, myself included, and especially as we go forward, you know, I'm only in my 20s. I'm sure when I get to David Baddiel's age, there's going to be things I've thought were funny now that I'm going to think, oh God, you know, that was awful. But I hope that I will, you know, David Baddiel's been very resistant to that until it became a cancelable offence, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's in public, I guess I better apologise publicly to make a point. Even the way he addressed it in this documentary felt like this very self-serving sort of, anyway, you can't use that against me, let's put this thing to bed. You know, it didn't centre Jason Lee, it didn't centre what he needed. You know, when we're looking at real apologies to people. It's not just something you do for show, it's something you actually feel. It's something you think, okay, I understand the impact, I'm really sorry about that. Do you want to talk about that? How would you prefer to be talked to? And for years, Jason Lee has said, I've never had a direct apology from him. And David Baddiel has just sort of brushed it off. When people have said to him, look, how can you be this anti-racist campaigner or paint yourself as that when you've done this thing? You've got this man, racial abuse and humiliation. You've made him a joke. And let's not, I've seen people defending this, even though David Baddiel himself has said it was racist. They're saying, oh, his hair did look like a pineapple. I've seen pictures of this guy. I'm not a football fan. This is just a black guy with his hair back. He's got longer hair, so he's tied it back, like many footballers do. Of course it's got racial undertones. Like, you wouldn't do that to a white player who had their hair back. There is nothing remarkable or funny about what that looks like. The only way you would think that would be through a racial lens. And I appreciate that in the past, I know it's not an excuse, and to be fair, he does say this himself, in the past it doesn't make it not racist that it was more normalised, but it was still racist. So it bothers me that people are still saying that now. It's heavily racialised. And I'm sure there was a part when he met Jason Lee for the podcast where David Baddiel said something like, I can't remember the exact phrasing, I might put it on the screen, something like, well, it was mostly my bad or something, or it wasn't all my bad, or, something like from my part. One of those rubbish things where you kind of don't take full blame. And that's not a real apology, it wasn't sincere. And full credit to Jason Lee, who handled it, really, really well. This is a man who actually does seem to be dedicated to anti-racism because he didn't want it to be like a feud. He was just grateful that it had been, sort of spoken about, put to bed. He was grateful for the apology and he hoped that we could, kind of move forward, everyone could move forward. And of course he brought up the point that, this idea that blackness and Jewishness are so polar opposite is obviously ridiculous because you have black Jewish people, obviously. And there's a history of this kind of anti-blackness from David Baddiel, which I'm not going to say, it's hard to say, when it comes to certain racisms, there's not always an evil intent behind it. Sometimes it's just a privilege, sometimes it's like an unacknowledged thing. And I would think he'd be able to realise this himself because that's what he was kind of arguing for on his show, but I don't think very successfully. There's this video I saw it a while ago actually, and I was reminded of it yesterday, of this I don't know, was it Soccer Sunday? I don't follow football, but anyway, David Baddiel was doing this TV show, and he regularly would pick people out of the crowd in football, to kind of laugh at. And he picked these two black guys out of the crowd, and it was hysterical to him, and the audience were laughing, and I might be able to put this on the screen. This isn't monetized, so I think I can probably play it on here. I'll play it for you now.
Actually, we've been scouring the footage of the crowds for the most ridiculous bloke in the World Cup so far, and we think we found him. Can we ask you something about this bloke? Can we see him again, Sylvia? Sylvia, can we ask you, do you think this bloke just looks like that, or has dressed like that for the game?
First of all, I don't like racism.
No, I don't think that was racist.
Anyway.
And when he was called out on that being racist, it was just kind of like pushed away, like, oh, you're too sensitive kind of thing. And that's, let's not forget, that's how David Baddiel's been for a number of years when people have tried to bring this up. He acted in the documentary like people being angry about this Jason Lee thing, which again, I say, like, when I say it ruined, I've said it ruined his career. Obviously it didn't ruin his whole career, but obviously it takes a real toll for a footballer to deal with that, to have that kind of racial abuse, to have that, being put out there to the public. It must be really horrific for him. And he's spoken himself about the impact that had on him, It's something he should never have had to deal with. Right, add to that, in this documentary itself, so there were two people that David Baddiel chose to put in this. So Whoopi Goldberg and Dawn Butler were the people he chose. And the Dawn Butler one, I have to admit, made me very, very cross. So Dawn Butler is somebody that is a left-wing black female MP. She's very left-wing, and she is subject to some of the vilest misogynistic and racist abuse you can imagine directed towards MPs. She's got, out of all the MPs put together, I'd imagine she's got, if you put all the stuff she gets put together, is probably, one of the worst you can imagine what she's dealing with. And David Baddiel takes aim at her in this. It's a choice to put her in this documentary. And it's just interesting that it's her and Whoopi Goldberg, two black women, that he chooses to put in those roles. Now, I'm not saying, obviously he does say after he shows Dawn Butler, he says, I'm not saying that she's deliberately anti-Semitic. But I just don't think, she was listing out minority groups in a speech. And here's the thing, I think this is in real bad faith. Because I can understand if you're talking about somebody, with a history of anti-Semitism. For example, when I say that I feel like David Baddiel has got some issues with anti-black racism, I'm not talking about a speech where, or a comedy skit where he lists people off and he forgets to say black people, I'm not saying that wouldn't be something notable if it was a pattern, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an actual history of anti-black racism. You know, either something intentional or something, you know, subconscious in him, you know? But that's where that's coming from. Now, with Dawn Butler, to put her in this documentary, now let's not forget, David Baddiel is supposedly doing this documentary about, you know, Jewishness and the struggles that Jewish people go through. And I will say, there are some brilliant parts of this documentary I wish there were more of, which is where he was talking to so many different Jewish people and talking about the kind of microaggressions, I put that in quotation marks, you know, the idea that microaggressions against Jewish people are just considered to be microaggressions rather than aggressions. I thought that was incredible. You know, and that's the sort of thing that I just found so brilliant, because I'm not Jewish. I do have Jewish family, but I'm not really around that particularly much. So I'm always wanted to kind of learn. And also, you know, I think if you're someone who's not part of a certain minority, you're always trying to, you know, I consider myself to be a lefty like progressive, or I try to be. So I'm always trying to, you know, examine myself and think, right, could I do this better? You know, I'm always trying to examine the things that society gives you. I think, you know, I do tend to think that we absorb a lot from our society, so it's helpful to unlearn things. And I feel like it helps if we're not stubborn. And again, that's the thing that I find so odd about David Baddiel, because he's quite stubborn and he's quite egocentric, isn't he? You know, he's still trying to defend himself. It feels like every time he pops into this documentary in his suit, he's kind of, you know, looking at you in that black and white serious way, as if to say, haha, you can't get me. You know, it feels weird tonally. You know, it just felt very odd that he kind of centered himself in this. I was surprised he was in it so much, honestly. Like, I don't think we necessarily needed those things. But we can't take politics out of this. And this is one thing which I find incredibly frustrating, which I think that David Baddiel weaponizes, and I think a lot of people do, which is the fact that, you know, he's saying that, you know, as a Jewish man, he doesn't have privilege. And I don't think you're privileged because you're Jewish. Of course you're not. But David Baddiel is privileged not because he's Jewish. You know, David Baddiel was a BBC celebrity. And he's still, you know, he's doing this documentary now. He's done documentaries before. Despite having a history of racism and homophobia, which is very open, you know, he's got away with that. He's been able to rebrand himself quite well. He went to a private school. So I just think he's not up front. I think if you're going to do something like this, I think that, to be fair, it's always best if you're gonna, you know, if you're gonna Louis through it, fine. If you're gonna not take a stance and just show different people's perspectives, that's fine. But if you're gonna do something serious like this, I think you need to be open about how you feel. And I think what was missing here is that David Baddiel is, you know, the description of this was the writer and comedian looks at anti-Semitism and the progressive left. So we've got to ask ourselves here, how much of this is about the anti-Semitism and how much of this is about the progressive left here? Because David Baddiel he's not a fan of the progressive left. David Baddiel is quite a centrist, and that's an important thing. If he's like the MC of this programme, that's something that we need to know about when we're watching the programme. Because what it felt like with Dawn Butler is that he was taking shots, and he's done this in the past, you know, and I think in some ways it's quite dishonest, because we can all do it. Like, we're, you know, if you're of minority status like I am, for example, if we wanted to, sure, we could do that. We could lean right into identity politics if we wanted, and a lot of people in bad faith do. Now, I try not to do this because I think it kind of undermines when there's a real issue, you know, and I think it makes people less likely to take things seriously, and I just don't think it's right to do it. But for example, you know, if I'm criticised for something that I say here, you know, that's fine. Anyone can criticise what I say. Of course, if the criticism is racial because I'm mixed race, or the criticism is sexist in some way, or the criticism is biphobic or homophobic in some way because of my sexuality and my orientation, of course, that's, you know, that's a different matter. But what David Baddiel is doing, it's so obvious to me as well, it makes me so frustrated, is that I get the impression he seems to think that the criticism he gets, he just goes, oh, it's because I'm Jewish. You know, he's changed his whole Twitter bio to Jew, which again, that's his business, why not? And of course he gets anti-Semitism because he's Jewish, because he's so openly Jewish. I don't deny that there's a bravery in that. Of course there is. Why shouldn't he own that? That's who he is. But there's something so disingenuous about it. And this whole show was really taking aim at the progressive left, and I'm just thinking, really? That's where it is. We're doing a show about, it's fake. It feels like a vessel for David Baddiel to make his own personal swipes and to kind of to cover it in these very serious subjects. And in some ways, I feel like the people in the documentary in some aspects were kind of used. There were moments when I feel like David Schwimmer, for example, was talking and David Baddiel was sort of, he didn't really listen to what David Schwimmer was saying, and it kind of felt like he kind of re-changed it. And I'm sorry, I don't really know this woman's name, but there was the mixed race woman who is half black and half Jewish. And, you know, when she was talking about her experiences, it very much felt like David Baddiel was kind of changing. I don't know, it just is frustrating because he wasn't impartial. And you don't don't have to be impartial, but don't then pretend you're doing this big study. No, everything has a bias. Of course it does. We have to be honest about that. The way he tacked in that sort of, and of course now I'll have to apologise to Jason Lee because every time I try and talk about anti-racism, silly trolls online keep posting pictures of it. It's that dismissiveness. It's almost this feeling that he can't imagine. To him, it's this personal slight. He thinks, oh, they're coming to get me because I'm David Baddiel and I'm wonderful and they just don't like me. But it's not that. Like, he doesn't consider the fact that actually there is a natural contradiction in the fact that you can't set yourself up as this anti-racist campaigner if you've done that. And it's not even the fact that you've done it, it's the fact that you still seem angry at people bringing it up. You're unable to properly put it away. For so many years, you could have apologised to that man. You could have examined. I mean, think about how amazing this could have been with someone who wasn't as, egocentric as David Baddiel. Like, imagine him, rather than this just being worked in as a sort of, now you can't get me anymore because I've publicly done it, see, and I haven't actually taken full responsibility and I've left it 20 years. So it's more about the public. Who does that? When you have a major apology to make to someone, I just have to say this. If you have a major apology, like a genuine one that sits in your heart, you don't do it like, well, I'll finally do it to put the trolls to bed. The trolls in quotation marks. See, look, I've done it. Now you can't get me anymore. It's self-serving. That's not a real apology. There was no real understanding. It still felt like he seemed like he thought he was persecuted even for doing it. And anyway, Jason Lee handled it with a lot of grace. But again, I almost feel like David Baddiel worked in this very serious issue. He's talking about the anti-Semitism he gets online, which is genuine, of course it is. But then he kind of shows on the screen it becomes a personal beef because he's saying, oh, look, when I try and talk about anti-racism, people point out that I was racist in the past. As if they're nasty trolls. And I'm thinking to myself, how are you doing a programme which is anti-racism and dealing with it in that manner? It's so glib. I would have thought your angle could be something like, we all learn and we all grow, and this is how I've learned and grown on anti-black issues, and I recognise this now, and this was why I thought it, and perhaps we can use this to examine why people hold anti-Semitism that might be unconscious, and, let's talk to the black Jewish community about how that feels. It was so centred around David Baddiel that everything important that could have come from it got lost. And there were also moments in this where it really... The problem is David Baddiel's sort of mindset, I think. I think he's one of those people that has to centre himself. Like, the type. But, there's a moment where he's talking about how Jewish people often have to change their surnames so that, they don't receive anti-Semitism, which is true. I mean, I've had situations like that in my family as well. Like, it's pretty obvious sometimes if you have a Jewish surname, and people will treat you differently because of that, of course. And then he says, you wouldn't ask a gay person to pretend to be straight to protect themselves. And I sat there for a moment watching that, and I thought, what? Because this is how it's coming across. It's coming across as like an ego thing for David Baddiel, It's like, see, it feels like an attack. This is the thing that frustrates me so much, because surely something like this, progressives and the left and, this group, of which, David Baddiel's taking aim at the progressive left, but he's not one of the progressive left. Like, let's be honest, he's not. This is a political attack from him. But something that's really important in that space is solidarity. So it's really important that different groups that are oppressed or persecuted in different ways have communication, and we build our relationships with each other and we support each other, because one person being oppressed from one group, we should feel it in other groups because that could be us. Now, how on earth is it helpful to try and say that, well, homophobia is gone now, you wouldn't do that to gay people? Yes, you would. Look at the world right now, right? Look at Hollywood right now. So even today in Hollywood and in television, there are gay, lesbian, trans, bi, LGBT people who have been told by their agents, or have had to make a decision because of society and the backlash, that they have to keep it quiet. Like, keep that on the down low, make people think you're straight. That's still a thing that's happening. In actual life, you've constantly got... This is just such an ignorant thing for him to say. In life, if you're an LGBT person, you are always, in every situation, when you're with new people, thinking... Because you're always sort of coming out, and you're always thinking, is it safe to do so? And you make little adjustments. You really do. It just becomes normal. You have to decide if these people are safe first before you do it. That's a thing that happens all the time. So this kind of, you wouldn't do it to gay people, but you'd do it to Jewish people. It's just gay Jewish people exist. It just felt really frustrating because it kind of felt like this is the only racism these days that is acceptable. And I'm not taking the argument that, oh yes, racism against Jewish people is totally acceptable. Of course it's not. But the idea of saying it's the one invisible racism is incorrect. We are in a country right now. I'm not saying, you know, one sort of racism is worse than others. But look at the anti-Muslim sentiment right now, right? Anti-black racism is skyrocketing. You know, the way we're treating migrants right now, it's getting, I just don't think there's something a bit off about it, you know, like I do understand from a certain perspective, you know, because I'm bisexual and I'm mixed race and white passing. So that stuff he was saying about, you know, Jewish people being perceived to have privilege because they can pass, I completely got, and I thought that was brilliant that he was speaking about that and people were speaking about that, because it is a sort of conditional passing. It's like, you know, you might not immediately be seen as a different race, and it's not, it's different. It's a different sort of oppression. It's very different to, for example, someone who's noticeably black or noticeably Indian. Like, members of my family will get immediately treated with racism. It's a very different, sometimes more violent, more explicit sort of racism. But you do, you know, it's not a privilege to be passing. It's still that feeling of, it's awkward. They explain it quite well on the show. I get that 100%. You know, but to say that's the one, you know, that's the racism, that's the blind spot, is simply not accurate. It's really not accurate if we look at society right now. Anti-black racism is completely on the rise, you know? And I felt like he kind of worked that into his argument. He was kind of, it all just feels like a big, sorry if I'm wrong about this, but it feels like this big ego-driven response. Like, this whole thing was actually just orchestrated so he could finally stop people saying things about the Jason Lee thing. That's what the troll thing felt like as well. It was like this whole academic, like, documentary about trolling and anger. But really at the heart of it felt just like this guy being like, stop calling me out. You people are angry trolls. Stop calling me out. That's what it feels like. And I have to talk about the Israel thing because he brought it up in the documentary. So this, to me, is indefensible. It really is. And of course, I don't believe in any sense that, you know, Jewish people from around the world should have any connection to Israel. They might do, it's fine if they do, but they don't have to, you know. The actions of Israel, what the Israeli government is doing, what Israel as a state is doing, are not the responsibility of Jewish people around the world. And that's why I see a problem with people conflating anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Because the actions of Israel, the idea of Zionism, which is that it's this homeland for Jews, that's the Zionist argument, by the way. I'm not saying that myself. That's an excuse to be ethnically cleansing the Palestinians and to be engaging in, you know, colonialism, imperialism, and putting those three people through terror. That is the idea of Zionism is not the same as anti-Semitism. So it's dangerous to act like, you know, obviously there's a pretty huge and significant difference between being against Zionism, which is the idea of the ancient homeland of a group of people, that people are entitled to a birthright and homeland kind of thing, when it's on top of another group of people. And I think often the argument that Zionists do have, and when I say this, you know, people say Zionist is just shorthand for Jewish person, but that's not the case, because you've got Jewish anti-Zionists. You know, it's a different thing, and to conflate those things is dangerous because it means that you're associating Jewish people around this world with Zionism and acting like that's a natural connection. So you are then like involving Jewish people worldwide with what's going on. And, you know, when you think about the hate crimes which are being enacted towards Jewish people, that's so dangerous because you don't want to be associating normal Jewish people with the evil actions of what Israel is currently doing. It's not they're not doing it. It's not their fault, it's happening. So to speak out, so I think it's very manipulative when people say, you know, oh, you're saying Zionist and you mean Jewish person. No, it means, this also excludes Palestinians from the conversation, because how are they supposed to phrase it? Like, how are Palestinian people and people who support the Palestinians and who are anti-imperialism and colonialism supposed to discuss this? If every time they talk about Zionism, which is the political idea that, you know, there's a right of, in this instance, the Jewish people to be particularly there and to be ethnic cleansing Palestinians, you know, how are people supposed to talk about that? How are Palestinians supposed to speak about this situation if every avenue is being cut off and called anti-Semitic? Of course, it's unacceptable to be anti-Jewish people, and there are a lot of people who will be anti-Israel for the wrong reasons. You know, of course there are. Sometimes you come across people who are anti-Israel, and sometimes I think, okay, you've got to kind of judge it, haven't you? You're like, and why exactly is that? You have to find out. And if they're like, you know, sometimes you get far-right people who just hate the idea that there's Jewish people living there. You know, the idea that there's it's associated with Jewish people, so they hate it because they're anti-Semitic. But of course, then you have the other people who you'll talk about, you know, you'll be like, and why is that? And they'll say, because of the actions of what they're doing, because of what's happening to the Palestinians. things, and it's happening right now. How are people supposed to talk about that? How are people supposed to talk about that? Because this is an urgent issue. I follow a lot of people who are in Palestine. I try to stay informed as best I can. And this is an ongoing situation for them. They are living in real terror. And, I think about a lot what the people in Ukraine are going through. And there's so many, comparisons. Sometimes, I follow people in Ukraine as well. And I'm seeing people in Ukraine and people in Palestine both talking about how they hear, a loud noise outside and they wonder, is it a bomb? Has a building come down? Like, is it a drone? Or was it just a car door slamming? These people are just adjusting to this terrible situation. And a good thing and scary thing about social media is that you can get right to the humanity of so many different people because it's their exact words from where they're from. And you see that there's actually so much less that's different between us. There's so much, it's not much that divides us. These are similar situations. What Israel is doing is wrong, and it's wrong that the people of Palestine are being treated so appallingly as second-class citizens. This is colonialism, it is imperialism. It can't be anti-Semitic to say that. I mean, it would be if your only concern was Israel, of course. If you've got someone who's suddenly, they're just concerned with Israel, just Israel, then of course you've got an issue. But I think if you're talking about people who generally their political stances, they are consistent in talking about imperialism, colonialism, all those different things. So, for example, in Britain, you need to say, so how do you feel about Britain and, how we made our money and the British Empire? You need to be consistent with that, of course. And the way I come at it is the fact that, I'm half Indian, half English. I know what happened to India. I know what happened because of the British Empire. The people in India were treated as if they weren't real people. A more Western force was going there, and all the people fighting back were terrible terrorists. And it's a similar story wherever you are in the world. But David Baddiel he brings it up, and then he goes, "Sure, Israel have done some bad things." I think that was his phrasing, and I was so angry. I was so angry because what about the Palestinians? These people this is right now. Gaza is about 50% children. There's so many children living there. They have their water controlled. They have their electricity controlled. There are checkpoints. Children get arrested for throwing stones. It's absolutely horrific what's going on there. Done some bad things. It's so downplaying a real world current evil. And I think you have a responsibility, if you bring that up on your documentary on Channel 4, to make sure the world doesn't forget what's happening with the Palestinians. And again, you can do this in a way which, again, protects Jewish people by saying, look, of course, being Jewish doesn't mean we're connected to what Israel's doing here. In fact, what Israel's doing is really bad. It's really bad. Please don't, take out your anger on random Jewish people because we're nothing to do with it. And in fact, it's disgusting. Wherever it would happen, it's disgusting. But you can't do that. They've done some bad things. They are currently doing this. The Palestinians are fighting for their lives. They are being ethnically cleansed right now. And it's just it's so fake. David Baddiel sits there with Miriam Margolyes and he says, I don't really feel any connection to Israel. Well, then why are you sitting there? Well, clearly there's something causing you to defend Israel. I'm not saying it's necessarily your Jewishness. I'm saying it's something in you which is making you probably the centrist, really, saying that actually ethnic cleansing is all right. It's all right the way the Palestinians are being treated. How could you? He says he has no connection and then he defends Israel. If you've got no connection and you're a normal person looking at that situation, I'm sorry, how can you see what is happening to the Palestinians and feel anything other than anger and disgust? And and what an opportunity that was to say, right, being anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish are different things. Do not take it out on Jewish people because of what's going on here. Do not do that. And he couldn't do it. It was just absolutely, I get so angry because I see what's going on in Palestine. And again, people like David Baddiel. And when I say they, and I'm sure people will say, oh, you mean Jewish people? No, I mean these sort of centrist figures who pretend they're completely unbiased, but they don't really care about colonialism and all these kind of things. They're just, to them, they're just things that, social justice warriors are just trying to get at me because I'm so wonderful and they're jealous of me or something and they're trolling me. No, some people in this world really do care about other human beings. It's sometimes it really is because people care. Now, when you bring up Israel, you're going to bring that up and you're not going to talk about the Palestinians. You brought it up. It didn't have to be in it. It didn't have to come up. You didn't even get into the issue. What a waste. What an awful, awful waste. I feel so angry watching it. I cannot believe how that was dealt with. It was just absolutely appalling. Anyway, I'm going to end this now because I'm struggling for storage. I'm on this, it's not my usual computer. But, what a frustrating documentary that was, because there was so much in it that was so inside. I learned so much because I have Jewish family, and for example the Y word you know, is something that's used against Jewish people, and it is something that's said in football all the time, and it's inexcusable. Like, it's not that you know, there was a man saying that they were shown I can't remember what it was for, you know, some sort of training thing, and they were asked, is something a racial aggression or a microaggression? And they decided that a swastika being painted on something was a microaggression. Of course it's not a microaggression, that is a full-on racial aggression. You know, to paint a swastika is racism against all Jewish people, all people targeted by those Nazis. That's a death sign. That made me really, really angry. And the idea that I didn't realise that kids in Jewish schools were having to do these young kids were having to do these practices for in case anyone came in and committed a hate crime. I didn't know that. It's just awful. But I just think David Baddiel inserting himself in that suit and just keep coming on and saying things that are smug and kind of making it about his own personal beef, just really, really, it was very, very frustrating. It really was frustrating. So yeah, let me know what you think. Sorry I'm not on the screen right now, but yeah, let me know what you think. It's so frustrating, and I think one of my pet peeves is when people like weaponize progressive language, people in the centre, and they just use it to shield themselves. It cheapens the progressive language. It cheapens the message. There's too many people who their ego is kind of getting a boost through it, you know. That's the opposite of solidarity. That's really what it felt like to me. Like, it did not feel like, oh, it's just frustrating. But, you know, there were some really interesting and useful things, some brilliant things that, you know, it's always good, I think, to hear a documentary which is, you know, different people from a minority group, and to listen to those microaggressions, because especially if you're not from that group, they're things that you don't really think of. I mean, I knew that Spurs fans got that. I did know that. My Jewish family were quite involved in the football community. So I did know about that. But I think hearing those personal stories is always a helpful thing, and to remind us that, you know, this is how we spot things, and especially people who aren't Jewish, it helps us to spot it more, I guess. But anyway, yeah, let me know what you think. Love you loads, and I'll see you really soon. All right, love you. Bye.